Hi, I'm Francisco.
Sean.
Taylor.
Osama.
And I'm Natalia.
And today we'll be talking about communication accommodation theory. First, we'll be telling you what communication accommodation is, then how it's used in the workplace, how it's seen on social media, and finally, how it affects company culture. Okay, what is communication accommodation? According to communicationtheory.org, it's the adjustments people make when they're communicating with one another. There are two dimensions to communication accommodation. There's convergence and divergence. Convergence is when people's communication theories begin to assimilate to one another, and divergence is when their communications differ. The picture situation where you just met somebody and they have a different style of speaking and you find yourself mimicking that and you feel you communicate better because of that. If you've been in that situation, you've experienced communication accommodation. Now that I've told you what communication accommodation is, I'll let him tell you how it's used in the workplace.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about communication accommodation in the workplace. Could I get the computer real quick? Okay, appreciate it. Okay, so as I'm sure all of us have noticed, the modern workplace and even classroom has become increasingly diverse, especially in a place like Dallas and this school. I'm sure you guys can notice that. And so when I talk about diverse, I mean across a lot of different parameters such as race, sex, socioeconomic, political, such on and so forth. And so in these types of environments, communication accommodation, like especially in a business environment, is often used to sort of limit conflict and increase efficiency because it can make things a lot easier as far as like interpersonal communication and making things more kind of objective for people to understand. But at the same time, this kind of dynamic sort of limits the expressions of minorities, just different types of minority groups, whether it be based on, like I said, gender, race, socioeconomic. And so I think it's important that we sort of acknowledge these things in the workplace because even though efficiency and making money is important, it's also important to acknowledge like individual people. So according to the research that we've done, there is obviously a higher degree of difficulty in cross-cultural communication. And so typically minority cultures in the workplace, specifically talking about race and national origin, they typically have to accommodate their speaking style in order to fit the majority. So of course here in America, people from foreign cultures would have to accommodate their speaking style to speak in more Americanized ways. But what we've kind of seen is that if we can allow different cultures to sort of express themselves more honestly, it actually builds trust in the workplace and just facilitates more sort of teamwork dynamics. So, and also just cross-cultural communication is something that's vital to the economy because we're living in an increasingly globalized world, especially like I said, you guys can see that at UT Dallas and in the Dallas area, I'm sure, especially in business. So this is something that by acknowledging that people have different cultural differences and that we are forcing them to accommodate, if we can acknowledge that, it helps us sort of build bridges with other cultures. And then the next thing is in the workplace, we're going to talk about gender accommodation. So according to our study, there's sort of a non-accommodation cycle in the workplace in regard to gender. And what that kind of means is that essentially men are sort of groomed in the business environment to behave in a certain way with women and women in a certain way with men. That's kind of designed to be sort of non-controversial and kind of sort of something that can avoid lawsuits, if you will. And so women's views a lot of times are often suppressed or neglected for the sake of just trying to sort of maintain face and be traditional. And so women are often encouraged to accommodate their speaking styles or other behavioral patterns in order to sort of facilitate better business, like we said. And so recognizing these sorts of inequalities is very important in order to kind of empower women in the workplace or just empower other genders outside of the majority gender in the workplace so that we can kind of have higher understanding. And I'm going to pass it on to Shay.
So like we can use communication accommodation in the workplace, it is also very prominent in social media interactions. And then, as you know, when you converge with someone, you're going to be assimilating to their speaking style. We can also translate this to our online interactions. With this is a study of textism, which is intentional nonverbal cues. What I mean by that is when someone speaks, you unconsciously do nonverbal cues, whether it's yawning or tapping your foot as if I don't want to be here. But when you're texting, you have to intentionally show that, whether it's all caps or you write LOL, anything like that. We can apply this even further by understanding how it can be used in the workplace. Whenever someone sends an email or texts their boss, anybody higher above them, some of the things that we noticed was that power status, and also if you liked or wanted to be liked by the receiver, you'll use more textism, meaning more similar texting styles, or just you'll accommodate more to their texting style. So it can move on from speaking to how you type. And then adding on to this is how we can also see this with brands. So many brands have now turned to Twitter as their main form of communication with their customers. One of their biggest objective is to build brand trust. How they can do this is with textism. They'll use similar styles to their customers. As we can see, Wendy's is pretty much keeping up with pop culture. And studies have found that when they use a convergence theory, it's when it's most effective and they can build more brand trust. The only issue here with brands is that they need to balance out brand consistency and also their communication strategy. So to wrap it all up, like the brands, we ourselves also have to balance out keeping our authenticity and also keeping our communication style to better communicate with people in our online interactions. And so now I'm going to move it on to the conclusion with Natalia.
I'm actually going to be talking about communication accommodation and how it affects company culture. So, according to a study done in 2018 by Giles and Galios, people tend to want to minimize their social differences, and this is no different whenever we look at interactions between coworkers. So, according to communication accommodation theory, people not only want to minimize their social differences, but they want to portray themselves in the most positive light possible when communicating. So, between coworkers, we may see them using like slang or industry-relevant jargon in order to feel as part of the in-group in the company. And those who don't make these accommodations are usually seen as part of the out-group. And it's the relationship between these two groups and how they work together that affects overall company culture. We can also look at this in interactions in between levels of employees, between higher and lower level employees. So according to an article written by Prescott in 2013, people tend to accommodate up or down in the workplace depending on the level of the employee that they're talking to. So for example, if I was in the room with an entry-level intern and a higher-level executive, you would see them try to accommodate to each other. So basically, the intern would maybe try to use more professional language and make themselves seem more qualified to impress their boss and give a good impression. And conversely, the higher-level executive might try to make the environment a little bit more casual or to bring down the language a little bit so he's not intimidating, and in the same way to portray himself in a positive light to his employee. Whenever we talk about communication accommodation, especially with managers, it can be used really effectively if done right. So for managers, it's really important for them to use their communication accommodation to communicate clearly and to not use any isolating language so as to not stunt any kind of group norming between their employees. And managers also have to be careful about striking a good balance between accommodating too much and not accommodating enough, because if they don't accommodate enough, they're not going to be clear, their employees aren't going to work as well, and it's not going to be as efficient. But if they accommodate too much, they could even break things down to a level far below what their employees already know, and it could actually be insulting to his or her employee's intelligence if he over-accommodates. And it also can just seem really ingenuine. So especially for managers in cultivating company culture, it's important to strike a balance using communication accommodation. And now Shayla and Frank are going to lead us in a class activity.
So here's a scenario. We're going to have three different people that you would be talking to: your friend, your boss, and your coworker. So now here's three different ways that you can respond. And the scenario is essentially that you can make it to an event And so we would like for you guys to take a second to either write down or mentally jot down how you would respond and match it to the different people. And then we'll have some questions to follow up.
Essentially, you find the best match per person with the response, and once you guys feel ready, I don't know, lift the finger up or let us know when you're ready. Okay. What did you choose?
So the order is C-A-B. So you said your friend, hey dog, I can't make it, and that's something came up. Not saying that to the boss. A is really formal, that goes to the boss, and then B is somebody on your same level.
Okay. And would you ever in a situation like flip it?
If I had like a personal relationship with the boss, and like we were really close, then yeah, I might actually say, hey dog, I can't make it, and that's something came up. But only if I know him really, really well.
Okay. Did anybody have a different response, or everybody agrees? Okay.
So why do you guys think that you would respond differently to your boss than you would to your friend? Somebody raise your hand. Yeah.
Just out of respect,
Because
it's like
you-
a power imbalance. You want to treat them with the respect that they are owed.
Yeah. So you want to portray yourself in a positive light. If you were to be too formal with your friend, they'd probably be like, why are you talking to me like that? So just portray yourself in a positive light.
So this just kind of shows the different sexisms that we were talking about, whether it's slang, whether it's, you know, using acronyms or anything. You need to be aware of how you use it and when you use it. And like you said, if you have a personal relationship, is it appropriate to use it? And so we just wanted to show this in all summed up, all of our points in one.
Basically, you accommodate at different levels every day. You might not notice it. How you speak to your best friend, not how you talk to your mom, obviously. So there's different levels of accommodation.
So now to wrap this all up, we're going to have Sam give us a conclusion.
And as a quick recap, it's been a couple of seconds since we've been through the presentation. So yeah, we basically talked about communication accommodation theory and how it's prevalent in the workforce, social media, and also the company culture. So furthermore, if you really pay attention on your day-to-day basis, you'll realize that communication accommodation theory is really prevalent in the majority of your tasks. So like we stated in the activity, you wouldn't use the same tone speaking to your mom as you would talking to a friend, you know? It's just really not the wisest thing to do. And lastly, if practiced regularly, the theory can help you communicate more effectively in areas such as your workplace, family settings, and etc. And as business students, it is very important to be aware of your setting and how you're delivering your overall professionalism. So to wrap things up, who knows, that one factor could be the reason why your application is chosen over amongst the many other applications that were submitted for the same job position that you're wanting to go for.
Thank you. Now we'll open up to any questions that you guys might have.
Not everybody all at once.
Okay, cool. So there's been examples of like extreme social uninteraction between like different situations, whether voluntary and involuntary. Is this more of an innate thing that people automatically know without being taught by their parents or by peers, or is this something that is learned and is different between cultures?
If I get into that, based on what our research is, it is more of a nurture thing versus nature. And the reason why is because, like, probably when you were in elementary school or something, a lot of kids are just talking however they want. As you grew up through middle school, high school, college, the business world, you slowly learn to have to adapt because it's kind of like a trial and error sort of thing. So life kind of shapes you into this because that's sort of what becomes successful. And so one of the things we want to do is just like acknowledge that and say that it exists. We're not necessarily saying it's right or it's wrong. It just does exist. And in fact, like one of the points that I was kind of making with my thing is that it's probably better that we become a little bit more open-minded about that. So I'm maybe a little bit against this theory, at least in what I came up with from my research. But yeah, it is something that is learned and sort of like, it's sort of like a survival tool, if you will. So, yeah.
And to To add on to that, it's learned, but it's also affected by the culture you're in. Of course, we're not going to, I can go into the six-dimensional cultural dimensions, but even power status, if you're in an Asian culture, you might even be even more cautious of how you speak to a superior, as opposed to here in America, where you can crack a joke with the CEO appropriately and still be fine. So then definitely it's your environment that will shape you as well, and your culture.
So like in all your research, did you find that there's like a baseline? So like the way I talk to my friend might be the most natural way that I would communicate, or maybe the way I talk to my parents would be the most natural way to communicate.
There was a research I saw where there were people communicating, and the longer you knew somebody, and the longer you got, or the more you got along with them, the more you accommodated to the way they spoke. They put you in the two situations. So one was with a friend that you knew for a while, and the other situation is with a stranger. And in both scenarios, it was controversial topics where both of you had opposite points of view. And because you knew that person, you did communicate and accommodate the same way. But when you didn't know them and it was the same scenario, there was no communication and accommodation. One person would talk in a certain manner and the other in the opposite. So basically, the more you know somebody, the more you're nurtured with somebody or accustomed to somebody, the more you accommodate to their communication.
Anybody else?
Thank you guys.
This is